Good afternoon, everybody. It's very good to see so many of you here today for our latest series of Productivity Masterclasses. I'm Mary Costello from the UK Commission on Employment and Skills, and we've developed this Masterclass series in conjunction with Lakes at the Institute of Education, University College London. Today we're really pleased to welcome Dr. Jun Du, who's a reader at Aston University Business School and is a member of the Enterprise Research Centre, which is sponsored by ESRC, to look at a more micro-level perspective of productivity, looking at firm growth. So that complements our last one very well. We had Dr. Martin Wheel talking about the macroeconomic issues around productivity. So we'll hand over to Dr. Jun Du, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, for the kind introduction. It's really great to see some of the familiar faces and some are not. And thank you very much for coming along to sacrifice your lunch break and hear me talking about productivity and growth. I would rather think of this as not a masterclass, because really I have little to offer in the background that you all have, been in the industry for so long and you know probably more than me. But I would rather think of it as a research update. It's an opportunity for me to tell you about two pieces of research that I've done in recent couple of years related to growth and productivity. And my goal is that by the end of the day, I would like to sell you an idea. Maybe this idea is already acceptable for you, but in case it's not, I would like you to buy this idea that productivity is actually very important for growth. In business sector, I think what's cared about more is profitability, revenue. And for policymaker, probably it's more about employment. But productivity is crucial, and I would like you to gradually sink in this idea with me telling you a bit of evidence I've discovered. So there are two things we're going to talk about, and two things we really care about. One is growth, one is productivity. I think it's quite self-evident to talk about how important is growth. Behind growth is jobs, is employment, is welfare, income, revenue, everything we care about for the economy to be sustainable. Of course, there are different levels of talking about growth. So in the two pieces of research I'm going to talk to you about, the first one is talking about, is more focusing on micro level, firm growth. And the second one is to talk about firm growth, but in terms of the contribution to the aggregate level of economic growth. Second thing we really care about is productivity. And why? There's a huge amount of literature in the last 3-4 decades in the economics and management and business to talk about how important is productivity. In very short term, productivity, obviously there are different ways of measuring it. Let's just forget about that for a second. Productivity has been established by the large economic literature that it is actually one of the accurate predictor of the long-run economic growth. And also, it is predicting short-term economic volatility. So when we think about worldwide, when you look at some countries which have been trapped in a kind of middle income trap, one of the problems we identify is their productivity, to be more exact, measured by total factor productivity, has been kind of stuck. So one of the ways to detract from the middle income trap is actually to improve productivity, and more precisely to grow faster than US, about 3%. So productivity is crucial, is very important. And when we link to job growth, employment growth, revenue growth, the link is kind of vague. And that is one of the motivations for the first piece of research to be done. And everything we're going to talk about are mainly coming from the two pieces of research myself and ERC colleagues have been conducting the last 2-3 years. The first paper has been published in Small Business Economics. It's published with open resource, so if you're interested, it's in the public domain. Second piece of research, which now is a report, I think many BEAS colleagues have already seen them, if you're interested, and it's being revised, will be made publicly available very shortly. Okay, so I will talk these two papers in turn, and they are done with different motivations, different research questions in mind, different methodology, different data, and with different answers to specific questions. But more or less, these two research studies will lead to more or less related and similar messages. So the first paper is basically linking high growth firms and productivity. This piece of research was initiated about 3-4 years ago when this OECD definition of high growth was still very hot. So the idea actually came from this desire of filling the research gap. At the time, and now we even know more, at the time we have already seen a large literature on high growth firms. A high growth firm, why it was very interesting because it creates disproportionately many jobs. And there are the research demonstrating how important it is for high growth firms to contribute disproportionately more in terms of jobs, innovation, and how important they are in terms of export, internationalization, etc. But at the time, there was the link between the high growth firms or high growth phenomena and various ways of measuring it with productivity was missing. So we'll come back to the research question a bit. So the question is, why should we expect even there's such a link between high growth firms or high growth experience of firms with productivity? There are evidence and there are theories to say, yes, we have reasons to expect that link, and there are reasons that we shouldn't. So majority of the literature establishes that when firms grow fast, probably it has been because entrepreneurial spirit, because of the innovation at the foundation, because of the ability and the status of upgrading the technology and large investment in the capital investment. So these reasons can link with productivity literature to explain the reasons that productivity can increase. On the other hand, when productivity is high, firms are more likely to have superior managerial skills, have some kind of innovation, have accumulated years because of learning by doing, and all these elements can feed into the reasons that drive high growth. So based on the literature we have already known from productivity separately, and from the literature of fast-growing firms, there are reasons to link them together, although it hasn't been really empirically tested. But on the other hand, there are reasons to suspect, maybe this link shouldn't be there. Why? For example, the learning by doing. Learning by doing is one of the most established theory for firms. And it's talking about firms need years to accumulate experience in order to learn. So should we expect that when firms really become productive and it immediately will get fast growth and it can sustain actually for more than 3-4 years period? It is kind of vague. And on the other hand, Penrose effects, for example, talking about when firms grow, when firms become productive to a certain level, they tend to be trapped in the kind of state that it's really difficult to go further. So when firms become more established, after the survival period, it is really difficult to proceed. So at that stage, you can't really argue that the productivity can actually make you grow much faster. So there are some studies, not many studies, to prevent us to link these two phenomena. So this paper is really to empirically examine two questions. The first question: does high productivity growth of firms more likely to help firms to become high growth firms? And in this particular paper, we measure high growth by high growth in revenue. And the second question is that does high growth experience, if firms have reached such status, does that experience really help firms to become more productive? So if you like, these are the two sides of the coin. So we want to examine that empirically with kind of rigorous econometrics. Okay. In this paper, we use FAME data. FAME data is one of the commercial data set for the UK companies. And for those who know micro data set, probably this is not one of the data set people are really fond of. But from commercial point of view, this is one of the large firm level data that is around, and which can give us the opportunity to build a panel data over the last 10 or so years. And this data set has more bias towards large firms rather than small firms, although there are quite plenty of observations of the small businesses in the data set. So from the observations we have obtained, which in total is about 183,000 firms over the over 10-year period between 2001 to 2010, we have calculated just based on the standard definition of OECD high growth firms, which is growing for 20% every year for the last 3-year period, which means you calculate over 4-year point, about 3-year period. So over this period, we have found for manufacturing and services, on average, if we calculate high growth by sales, we found about 8 to 9, nearly 9% high growth firms. And if we calculate service, that's 30%. And if we change the definition from sales or revenue growth to employment growth, that figure down to 2% and 5.6%. And this 5.6% probably ring a bell because we have this kind of established with the population data set based on BSD that for the UK during the similar period, the high growth firms by employment is about 6%. So more or less, I would say that using this data set produces probably the similar, not very far different, representation of the high growth firm of UK business population. So in this paper particularly, one of the reasons we use this data set is that we could construct total factor productivity. For those who are familiar with the measurement of productivity, there's a big science in there. There's one factor productivity, there are multi-inputs productivity calculation. And I think most commonly used is labor productivity, where we'll calculate how much we produce in output when we only account for one input, which is employment. So labor productivity is the most widely used one, especially at the macro level. One of the main problems with labor productivity, of course, is that we don't really account for other inputs. So, apart from the employment, we still have to use technology, we use capital, we have intensity of capital involvement. All these elements probably would just be lost if we don't really account them. So, if we're only thinking about one factor, labor productivity, there's a lot of omission when we calculate the efficiency of turning inputs into outputs. So TFP, total factor productivity, has its superiority in terms of measuring the efficiency of the production. And that's one of the reasons we use this. And I will skip the detailed methodology of measuring this. If you are interested, there's a very detailed account in the paper talking about the differences between them. So once we obtain,
sorry,
yes?
What was the F? I didn't catch what you said.
Oh, factor, total factor. Factor inputs. So once we obtain consistent, robust total factor productivity growth of firms, we're trying to link this productivity growth, actually we did both productivity level and growth, with high growth phenomenon. So roughly, I'm not going through all these detailed numbers. I think you probably they look dreary, especially at this hour. But basically, you will see 2 steps of this research. The first step is basically to explain what will lead firms to have high growth firms experience. So we are interested in how growth of the TFP will help firms to become high growth firms in revenue. So this is the first step we do. And our research question is, if firms are growing very fast in terms of productivity, would that give it more likelihood to become a high growth in revenue? Okay? So this is the first step. Second step is to look at if firm has had high growth experience in revenue. Would that experience help firms to grow faster in terms of total factor productivity in later period? So this is the 2 sides of coin. And for both models, there are problems with endogeneity, with heterogeneity, with measurement error. We have dealt with them quite rigorously. And I don't think this is a lunch talk. I'll leave it there. And if you are interested, please talk to me. So these are the 2 steps. And we tried with different methodology, different measurement, and to see how robust are the findings. And these are basically what we find. For the first side of the coin, does higher productivity growth lead to high growth incidence? And we find a definite yes. A definite yes for both sectors, manufacturing and services, although there are differences. We find TFP growth actually has higher impact, higher effect in terms of driving the likelihood of firms becoming high growth firms for large firms, for more established firms than smaller firms. Bear in mind that the caveat of this is that this data set is not really the best representation of the business population in terms of small business. That we will talk about in the second part of the talk. So with that caveat in mind, still we find that TFP growth is probably more growth driving in terms of revenue increase for the incumbents rather than new firms for manufacturing. But the effect is just the opposite for services, which indicates that for services, accumulating experience, learning by doing probably will have more role to play in this process. And we have discovered some other impacts which will help firms to get on with the high growth ladder. I will leave it there. They're more or less consistent with the previous literature, but this is not the core findings. The second question, the second side of the coin, is does high growth experience help firms to achieve more productivity growth? And the answer is yes as well. And this holds along the entire TFP growth distribution. Why we are looking at the whole TFP distribution? Because the rationale for this is that we assume that the firm at the different level of productivity level, the growth driving impact of high growth experience should be different. When you are more experienced and when you are a startup, the experience you have already accumulated should have different impact. That's why we look at the whole quantile distribution of the TFP growth. And when we look at that, we find for the whole distribution of TFP growth, this effect exists. Although the intensity is rather different, it peaks towards the end of the high distribution of productivity growth. That means if a firm has already been very productive, and with the driving force of the high growth experience, that effect will be much larger, much higher than the firms which are in a low distribution. When firms were probably just started up or just trying some technology, so the productivity is not that high. This impact is less than the high productivity end. And we also discussed the channels. So how does this high growth experience help firms become more productive? And we find age is actually having the negative sign, which indicates probably on average when firms are starting up, they are accumulating experience at the beginning, there's less inertia, and this high growth experience is more impactful than the others. But the size is actually the opposite. So there are various discussions. For example, with intangible assets, this has positive effects, but it's kind of disappeared when we control different impacts, suggesting it's not so robust. But for some chunk of firms with different heterogeneity, this intangibility, the innovation plays more important roles. So overall, this bit of research evidence suggests that it's a success breeds success story. So this is what we called success breeds success and growth a self-reinforcing process. So in general, we find the firms which are more productive in terms of TFP growth are more likely to become high growth firms. And firms with experience of high growth firms in revenue are more likely to be growing faster in terms of productivity. And between different stages of firms' life cycle, incumbent versus startups and old versus young, there are quite marked difference between these impacts. And we find we find the differences between regions are not so obvious, but they are playing a role when moderating the growth channels from the productivity side to the high growth phenomenon. And this would have impact on how the growth, how the policies could form to encourage the kind of right high growth firms to become more productive, and that would have the growth self-reinforcing impact on the later on productivity growth. So this is basically the key messages of this study. Overall, we discovered there is kind of quite established a strong causal link between productivity and revenue growth. But another caveat is that when we talk about high growth, most of the times probably we're thinking about employment growth. And this study has been conducted based on the high growth of revenue, not of employment. Obviously that is quite interesting and important question to investigate. And I suspect the relationship between the two probably will not be the same. Whether the relationship will still holds between the high growth in employment and productivity, it is still a question mark. Okay. And next study I will talk about is the study where we have most recently done. This is really in line with the rising literature of productivity puzzle of the UK. So probably everybody has known this and interested in discovering more, that we have UK has experienced a large productivity drop over the recent Great Recession. And a lot of studies are mushrooming out to document this phenomenon and to investigate the reasons behind it, and obviously to discover what we can do to catch up, to avoid enlarging gaps between us with Europe and US. So this study is in line with this literature. I think you have heard from the Dr. Wills recently as well. We have reviewed the whole literature, and we're trying to fill a gap, in short. At the beginning of this whole literature, I think at the beginning of the documenting the evidence, people were using macro data. And gradually, we have stepped into using microdata to investigate the dynamics of firms and explain the dynamics of firms over this whole period in terms of explaining why the productivity has dropped as such. One of the conclusions we have heard so far is that we as a nation is not doing so particularly well in terms of resource allocation. And that is a question we would like to investigate in this paper. That's one gap. The other gap is that in the whole literature, there's no particular angle focusing on small business, which is one of the main findings that ERC colleagues are investigating, because during especially the last 10 years, we see small business has been booming, and there are a lot of evidence to suggest that small businesses are playing a more and more important roles in the economy. So in this particular paper, we want to investigate the roles of different kind of firms. That's the term, heterogeneous firms there. We want to investigate firms in different sectors, different size and age, in particular small business, and firms which was showing the different kind of productivity growth patterns, and how do they contribute to the whole productivity, and more exactly, how do these kind of different firms contribute to the productivity puzzle. And for this paper particularly, we chose to use the population data of UK firms, which is based on business database, structured database, which is the only population of data. And I think it's worth mentioning that when you have the pros, you have the cons. So the drawback of the BSD is that it doesn't give you much information. So we couldn't talk about, for example, intangible assets. We couldn't really construct total factor productivity. What we could do is to show a comprehensive picture of the firm growth and firm productivity, at the same time investigating the dynamics of these firms over quite a long period of time. Okay, so let's just crack up. I would like to show you, first of all, some existing picture of the statistics. I'm sure many of you have already seen this before. So basically, 3 pictures here to show you over the examined period, 1998 2013, when we had the most recent data, the changes of employment, turnover, and labor productivity. Okay, bear in mind that here the only measure we can capture, we can define, we can use is labor productivity, given the data restriction, which is defined by revenue over employment. Okay, so employment. The solid line you can see is employment level, and dotted lines are growth. And as you can see, over the recent period of recession, we have a huge drop of employment, and that is that is the drop in employment. And slightly different picture is from turnover. Over the same period, we have huge drop, and actually it's not one drop, it's two drops. Okay? And that drop in growth of the employment is about 4%, and this turnover is about 9%. And actually, one of the debate behind the productivity puzzle is that how come the employment growth has recovered quite soon, quite fast, relative to turnover? Because in fact, by the end of 2013, the turnover growth decline has not really recovered. So that brought a lot of debates on labor hoarding, a lot on the problems with labor market, in terms of how come the labor market has not reacted so sensitively to the employment, to the turnover decline. And here we have the picture of aggregate labor productivity and average labor productivity. Okay? And you probably can see this this concrete solid line's average labor productivity actually drops more. There's this more decline. And aggregate productivity is about actually the same level. There's a very mild decline. The difference between the two is actually accounting for the demographic change of the business population. So the difference between the two, the first one, average, is basically you add up all the revenues divided by employment. So that doesn't account the composition of the business population. What kinds of firms do you have? Do you have a bigger one? Do you have a small one? Do you have a young one? Do you have an old one? This is not accounted. But when we calculate aggregate productivity, that is accounted. So the difference between the two, in terms of how much it has declined, how much it has dropped, is mainly due to the business demographic change. Okay, so this is essentially what we'd like to explain. And this is quickly to show you there are changes in the business population composition. These are the figures, and you can see probably this the entrance is from high figure to low figure, and this is from low to high. This is the general trend. And this shows you different industries pictures. This is essentially telling you over the examining period there's a general trend of in business population in the UK, there are less entrants and there are more exits. Particularly over the last period of Great Recession, we see more firms dying and we see less firms entering. So this is one of the elements we capture in terms of capturing the demographic change in the business population. And there's further evidence in the report actually telling us in the last 10 years, it's not just for the last 3 years, actually there are much more single employed firms, and they are on average less productive. Okay, so the task of this study is basically to decompose UK's aggregate productivity growth into different contributors. Okay, so here, this solid line is the aggregate productivity level of the UK. And the first step of analysis, the goal is to decompose this into different elements and to see which one contribute more and which one contribute less. So the decomposed components are the following. This one is basically within firms' average productivity. So if you like, this is the contribution from the existing firms. The firms are there already, and how their average productivity change have counted for the aggregate productivity level of the UK. Okay? And these are the new guys. So over the period, the newcomers, how are they contributing to the aggregate productivity? And this one is exit. The firms which have died, are they helping to make the whole pot become more productive or not? And this one shows you the resource reallocation effects of the within firms. Here, I think it needs a little bit explaining. So if you think about an economy, suppose this economy consists of a number of firms, okay? And there are two ways for this whole economy to become more productive. One is that every single one of us, firms, to become more productive. So if on average we are more productive, then the whole economy will become more productive. Okay, so this is one way which is quite obvious. Second way is that suppose none of us is becoming more productive, okay? But because I am more productive, if I can get some of your resources, I become bigger and you become less, you become smaller, then the whole economy-wise, if we take into consideration of the weights, then the whole economy becomes more productive without any single individual firm becoming more productive. Okay? So the second way is basically resource reallocation. That the theory suggests that if the market works well, the market composes of a lot of things, institutions and financial markets and information symmetry, a lot of factors play. If they are working well, then more productive firms should become more productive because it's easier for me to get resources and I have better price, I will sell more and you will sell less because you are less productive. So overall, in the equilibrium, more productive firms should become bigger. So this will mean that the economy has a better resource allocation effect. And this line precisely documents the effect of resource reallocation of existing firms. So if that market mechanism I just described to you works well, this should contribute positively and should improve. Otherwise, it will just become less because some factors in this market mechanism is not working well. Okay, so this is our task. We decompose this aggregated productivity into these elements, and this is what we find. First thing first, for the within average productivity, you can see the general trend describes the overall aggregated productivity growth. So this is the first message I'd like to convey. The aggregated productivity of the economy is driven by the within firm, existing firms within firms are more or less the same thing, the existing average firms' productivity level. So if the existing firms becoming more productive, then the aggregate productivity will increase, otherwise it's not. So the main drops, ups and downs, actually mentioned here, the productivity decline of the recent financial crisis is not unique. It happened before, it had actually happened even in a worse status. So all these ups and downs are captured by the average firm's productivity. So this is the dominant picture. If the existing companies are becoming more productive, the aggregate productivity will become more prosperous. Otherwise, it will decline. And in terms of the figure of the contribution, that figure is actually contributing for about 95%. Okay? The rest of the 5% are here. And we see that over, especially the financial crisis period, the contribution of exits are less. The contribution of the entrants is less. They all declined. And they declined for different reasons. We have dig up the figures and investigate the reason behind. The decreasing contribution of the exits is mainly because there are more exits happening during this period. And not exited firms were the least productive firms. So you could probably immediately link with all these cash flow problems and the difficult to finance problems and the breakdown of the capital flow. All these reasons probably make some of the companies, although they are not productive, not unproductive, but still they had to exit. The reasons for the decreasing contribution of the entrants is that over this period, there are less entrants. Don't forget the ways to contribute to this contribution is one, the average productivity of this group, and two is the weight. So over this period, there are much less entrants compared to other periods. So overall, the group of entrants has contributed less. And the final line actually is quite increasing. This is the resource reallocation between firms. And it's not, we expected this line should be decreasing, should be downsloping to indicate that the resource reallocation over the period has become much worse. But actually it is not. Although the average figure of the contribution is small, the resource allocation between the existing firms is actually quite sound. That indicates that during this period, although there are volatilities, but overall the resources allocating between productive and unproductive firms has been quite good in the sense that there's cleaning effect maybe, and there's maybe taking over happening. Although from this data set we can't really say for sure, but the resource reallocation between existing firms is not bad at all. Okay, this is basically a recalculation of not the productivity level, but productivity growth, and shows us more or less similar messages. So if you like, this quite volatile aggregate productivity growth has been decomposed into different components, and we see that what drives its up and down is basically the within firms resource allocation, within firms average productivity growth. So again, what accounts for the aggregate productivity or productivity growth is basically what's existing firms' productive performance doing in the economy, not really the resource allocation or the entry or exit effects. And what we can see, the overall resource allocation effect, this line is actually pulling up, except the last period. So overall, the resource allocation is not as bad as we expect it to be. Okay, the next part of the analysis in this study is basically to capture the growth dynamics at firm level to explain their contribution in the aggregate productivity. We typologize and classify firms into 5 categories. So if you think about it in the economy, if every firm is becoming more productive, then the whole economy will become productive. So one of the starting points we think about this is to see whether individual firms are becoming more productive or not. So we classify firms into the firms which are showing productivity growth and those which showing productivity decline. And within each type, we further investigate the reason behind this productivity growth or decline. For example, there are firms which look like the labor productivity has increased, but actually it is because both employment and revenue has declined. It's just revenue is not declining as fast as employment. So it looks like the company has become more productive, but actually this company is on the way of declining, and we call it fake growth. And we have growth hero, jobless growth, which are capturing different types of growth, but both are growing. It's just a different speed of growing. The employment and revenue are different. And the growth hero particularly is what probably policymakers would love the most, because this kind of companies will show revenue growth and employment growth at the same time, but revenue growth is growing even faster than employment growth. And we see jobless growth, we tend to interpret this type of companies as the companies that are booming, but at the same time becoming more efficient. Although the revenue is picking up, they're not recruiting more. For reasons we can't really pin down, but it could be that because technology upgrading or identifying new market without the need of expanding the employment size. There are 2 types of negative productivity growth or productivity decline. One is decline by efficiency loss, and this type of companies you will see the turnover decrease but employment grows. So it is difficult to give a nature of this kind of company. It could be because the company have really just become less productive and inefficient. But at the same time, but it could be the companies are accumulating capacity. So over the financial crisis, they see opportunities in the market, they take over, but without immediately having the deals to expand production. So this could be that as well. And we would like to see how this type of companies are contributing to the aggregate economy. And there's another type is decline by contraction. So this is both employment and sales are declining, but the sales is decline even faster. Okay, so what does the composition say? So this, if you like, this whole space is business population of UK from 1998 to 2013. And if you calculate the different composition, we would observe on average in the business population there are half firms which show productivity growth and half firms show productivity decline. So this is quite steady. We shouldn't think of, okay, if a company is showing productivity decline, it is bad. It is not necessarily bad, as we mentioned. It could be accumulating capacity, it could be business strategy, and etc. But on average, we should observe that. And interestingly, when time was difficult, for example, at the beginning of 2000, when the dot-com bubbles happened, and recent financial crisis, we see this composition changes. Okay, for example, in the recent period of a great recession, we see the proportion of companies which show negative productivity growth or productivity decline reaches about 60%. So it is not a reason or cause of any productivity decline, but it is a phenomenon. It is kind of statistical sign of time is difficult. So during difficult times, we have more companies which show productivity decline than growth. What about the exact composition? So as you can see, the large chunk of this black part, a dark part, are the companies which show decline by contraction. So over the last 4 or 5 years, financial crisis, we see the proportion of that group has increased from 1/3 to about 47%. And similarly, we see the decline by efficiency loss, this has increased. So more companies become less efficient because when their revenue drops, they did not really sack their labor right away for the reasons of maybe including labor holding and others, maybe information asymmetry, maybe accumulating production capacity. We also see that jobless growth has become less. So remember, I argued that we tend to interpret these kind of companies as companies becoming more efficient. And during financial crisis, this proportion of companies has become less. And this is more or less sensible as well, because during these times, there's not enough spare cash to upgrade your technology to become more efficient, and also companies are hesitant in terms of letting labor go. Also, one of the important factors we can't really control in this study is to calculating the wage, because sometimes the labor and employment in terms of size is not changing, but you could probably change the way of contract is being done. So all these signs are more or less consistent with our expectations. And here, there are two small proportion of groups are quite interesting. One is growth hero and fake growth. And in fact, growth hero, this proportion is about 4 to 5% on average. And this is the most stable group among all. And even during financial crisis, this proportion is not changing. So even during difficult times, this group it shows its resilience. So that's quite interesting. And it will be interesting to see how this group is contributing to the aggregate economy. So this is, if you like, the statistics of the growth type. And the next thing we did was to assign the contribution of each group in terms of helping the aggregate productivity of the economy to sustain. We're only picking up here 2 groups for this presentation because we don't have much time. Very interestingly, you can see the red dots. These are the contribution of the growth heroes. As I just mentioned, the proportion of this group of companies in the economy is about 4 to 5%. Over the 10-year period, it's about 65,000 companies. And we tried different sensitivity in terms of defining them by growing 2 years, 3 years, up to 5 years. And we see that this small proportion of growth hero company, 4 to 5%, is contributing for about 15% of the aggregate productivity. So it's about 3 times. So this is quite interesting because the way we define this has nothing to do with high growth firms. Has nothing to do with the parallel research we're doing in the ERC in terms of Millennium 2000, growing 80%, 40%. So this is various ways to look at growth, high growth. But this way of looking at growth has no reason to coincide with, let's say, the OECD definition. But still, a small proportion of firms are generating disproportionately high impact in the aggregate productivity of the UK. Another group is decline by efficiency loss. This is about 13% of the business population. They contribute to about 30%. So it's also quite interesting. And I think one of the obvious questions next is why do they contribute more? How do they do that? And what can we do to help this phenomenon to be more prosperous and more sustainable? So this, if you like, is the core finding we have, and this will motivate the next step research to understand more about these growth heroes and exactly what drives them to contribute such more. Even during the financial crisis period, not only the proportion is stable, also the contribution is quite stable. So very shortly, so this study will have a few key messages. First of all, the significant business demographic changes are underlining the UK aggregate productivity change, featured by the increasing number of small business, especially single-employee firms, more exits and less entrants. Heterogeneous firm growth patterns are behind aggregate productivity change, and we find several interesting phenomena such as resilient growth heroes and a large chunk of decline by contraction firms, which may help understand several hypotheses on the productivity puzzle. And we find that within firm productivity improvement has been mainly responsible for aggregate productivity changes in UK, which is probably stands in contrast with the popular findings that we have discovered so far. And we find resource allocation, on average, play a very limited role in driving aggregate productivity change. So that's what we discovered so far. So very briefly linking these two studies, I think the key message is that we need to understand more about the fast-growing firms. And from the emerging evidence, we see productivity, even when measured by single-factor productivity, labor productivity, we see there's a link. There tends to be a causal link between productivity and growth of the economy. Thank you.